Thanks so much to the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies for including me in this important Herat Security Dialogue, and for including me specifically on this critical panel about Afghan women, betrayal, apartheid, resistance. I sincerely wish that I could be with you in person today, but am honored to join the discussion virtually. In my time today, I will share my forthcoming paper, The International Obligation to Counter Gender Apartheid in Afghanistan. It will be published next week in the Columbia Human Rights Law Review. Short summary is already available on the website Just Security in English with a Farsi translation by Zubaydah Akbar. To start, I will provide an overview of some of the main arguments and explain why I wrote this paper. My goal with this project was to find a way to enhance international responses to Taliban violations of the rights of Afghan women, to find international responses that are actually consonant with international law, and to ensure that the international community cannot simply walk away from its obligations to Afghan women simply by leaving the country. Given the lack of relevant standards on second state responsibility in international human rights law itself, I turned to the construct of gender apartheid as a means of achieving this goal. Now, the feminist case for responding to gender apartheid as apartheid was actually made the first time the Taliban took power in the 1990s. It was made by one lone UN expert, Abdel Fattah Amour, who you see here, a law professor from Tunisia, who was then the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. And this case was also made by some women's rights advocates in Afghanistan, in other Muslim-majority countries, and around the world. However, the international legal case for recognizing gender apartheid as apartheid was not fully made, and that's what I'm trying to do in my paper. The point is to get the international community to adopt the gender apartheid approach this time, and thus be more effective in its response to the grave situation on the ground under Taliban rule. To achieve these objectives, my research draws both from the academic literature and also on a series of 16 interviews conducted remotely with Afghan women human rights defenders from September 2021 to February 2022. It was critical to me that Afghan women human rights defenders, or WHRDs, are not just objects of this research, but also participants in it whose views help to inform the work. To review key aspects of the argument in the paper, I will address 4 questions it raises, time permitting. The first of these is, what is gender apartheid? Well, gender apartheid, as you see here, is a system of governance based on laws and/or policies which imposes systematic segregation of women and men and may also systematically exclude women from public spaces and spheres. Discrimination itself becomes the governance model. Gender apartheid involves systemic oppression of women, defining women, as one of the interviewees told me, as being not as human as men. This mirrors the experience of Black South Africans under the apartheid regime in that country. I turn now to the next question. How does the current situation in Taliban Afghanistan constitute gender apartheid? While the other speakers on this panel will address that issue in detail, I will simply say that today the Taliban have excluded women from most aspects of public life, as they did in the 1990s. Just to focus on 2 of the restrictions, they have prohibited many women from working, and they have done so in the middle of a terrible humanitarian crisis in a country full of war widows. Meanwhile, they have banned girls above grade 6 from going to school and broken repeated promises to open those schools. They are, in fact, the only ruling group to have done this in the 21st century. Most recently, we know women have even been banned from public parks, literally being swept out of public space. Those who courageously oppose these policies, mostly Afghan WHRDs, have been terribly abused. A new global commitment to end gender apartheid in Afghanistan would be a way of supporting those who are risking everything to demand their universal human rights on the ground. Almost all of the Afghan women advocates I interviewed agreed with the characterization of the country's situation as gender apartheid. mainly because they found this term to accurately reflect the way in which Taliban policy, quote, removes women from government and society, unquote. The women I interviewed also ratified this approach because they knew that the apartheid framework had been a key tool in improving the lived reality of Black South Africans in the past. The UN response and international norms were, of course, only one component of anti-apartheid initiatives, but they contributed to the ultimate success of these efforts with the end of racial apartheid beginning in 1990. What I'm basically arguing is that international law should learn from its own successes. This brings me to question 3, and you see this addressed on the slide here. If the situation in Afghanistan constitutes what I'm calling gender apartheid, what is the added value of the apartheid approach? So international law already has a robust paradigm for dealing with apartheid, developed primarily between the 1960s and 80s in response to the situation in Southern Africa and spurred by the dynamic commitments of decolonized states. It is explicitly drafted to respond only to racial apartheid and has not been formally used to address gender apartheid, as I argue it should be. Such a feminist transformation of international law, to use Charlotte Bunch's concept, is essential in the 21st century and would be the most effective way to respond to Taliban Afghanistan 2.0. It is perhaps worth reminding ourselves how change was made in South Africa. International political will and local political struggle were essential catalysts for change and had a dynamic synergy. Newly decolonized states played a leadership role, seeing the issue as a vital part of a larger struggle for decolonization and the achievement of self-determination. The African National Congress was even given observer status at the UN and carried out its own successful foreign policy. Highly publicized South African apartheid atrocities, such as the repression of the 1976 Soweto uprising, galvanized international opinion and action. The UN response and international norms were only one component of concerted, Global South-led anti-apartheid initiatives, but they created a powerful advocacy tool and helped mobilize global opprobrium for South African policy that, amongst other things, helped to break the deadlock on sanctions. As the academics David Walsh and J.E. Spence conclude in a review of the relevant external factors in a book called Ending Apartheid, it would be difficult to attempt a precise weighing for any one of the factors that basically contributed to the end of apartheid. It was rather their cumulative effect that did so. What can be asserted, they continue with some confidence, is that the changes that occurred in the norms governing state behavior were crucial. Western governments in particular had to pay at least some deference to these new norms, the effect of which was to give South Africa a unique status in the international society of states. And I think this is precisely what we have to try to do with Taliban Afghanistan, though the country situations and the times are indeed distinct. The most important of the racial apartheid standards was the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which came into force in 1976. The raison d'etre, the whole reason for this convention, was to maximize implementation capacity at the international level. This is precisely what we need in the case of gender apartheid. The convention defines apartheid as, quote, inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them, unquote. What I'm arguing is that if gender is substituted for race, this is an accurate reflection of Taliban policies vis-a-vis women. The concept of apartheid should also be applied to other highly structured systems of control and oppression enacted by one group over another on the basis of discrimination, which is certainly the case in Taliban Afghanistan. Racial apartheid became not only unlawful, but also an international crime. While no one was ever actually prosecuted for this crime, as South Africa pursued a truth commission during its transition, The Apartheid Convention, nonetheless, provided a critical advocacy tool for opponents of apartheid. It was used as a standard for judging other countries' responses to South African behavior, and it was regularly cited in UN debates. The convention codified the view of the apartheid regime as an illegal situation to be ended. This is what we need with regard to Taliban rule in Afghanistan as well, really a rejection of so-called constructive engagement, as the Apartheid Convention rejected engagement with racial apartheid in South Africa, demanding instead firm resistance. After the end of apartheid in South Africa, the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court confirmed that apartheid continued to be a crime and to rise to the level of a crime against humanity. The International Law Commission in 2001 recognized anti-apartheid norms as jus cogens, the highest level norms in international law. And my paper argues in favor of employing such a vigorous approach to confronting the equally heinous practice of using discrimination against women as a governance model, as in Afghanistan currently. This, I argue, can both empower and require rights-respecting responses from other states and from an international community which claims to value these human rights. International pronouncements in favor of equality without appropriate action discredit the Women's Human Rights Project. This impact is magnified as a number of states and international organizations are actually now sort of participating in gender apartheid by sending all-male delegations to Kabul. And as some states actually move towards normalizing relations with the Taliban, or even to promoting or supporting them internationally, as is the case with just a few governments like China, Pakistan, and Russia. So to return to this question of the added value, the apartheid model here offers a factually accurate description of the situation, but also one that carries the appropriate stigma. And it also can offer an essential mechanism for generating at least some global legal accountability for this transnationally created disaster of the Taliban's return to power. In the words of one of those I interviewed, Shahrazad Akbar, it can be a, quote, powerful mobilizing tool. The symbolic and expressive importance of applying the apartheid concept to a fact pattern like Taliban Afghanistan enhances what we call the mobilization of shame, which is a critical international law compliance tool. And it does so more effectively than using other terms like discrimination or even systematic discrimination alone. Those terms are just not strong enough to characterize the situation in Afghanistan now. And I think using the apartheid framing can put pressure on governments, international organizations, and even transnational corporations not to engage with the Taliban in ways that show tolerance for and help to perpetuate grave abuses. Using the term apartheid also makes clear the pariah status of the perpetrators. It elevates the status of the practice's local opponents. Conversely, a failure to employ this heightened concept and enhanced response to a regime whose well-known policies are this relentlessly anti-women sends a terrible message, first to Afghan women, but secondly to women all across the region, and finally to women everywhere, that their rights do not matter. I would argue that understanding the Taliban as perpetrators of apartheid, a grave international crime, could have a number of direct consequences by shaping and constraining the policy choices of other actors. And I'll just mention a few examples briefly. The group's leadership is already featured on UN Security Council sanctions lists, but it must remain so. And I think recognition of the Taliban policies as apartheid can help to ensure this outcome over time. The Taliban remain unrecognized at the UN and cannot take the seat of Afghanistan there. This too must continue to be the case as long as its gross human rights violations persist. Given the South African precedent where apartheid South Africa was ultimately ejected from the General Assembly, this result is more likely if the de facto authorities in Afghanistan are today understood to practice the international crime of apartheid also. And those states inching towards recognition could be more vigorously dissuaded. Those states that seek to normalize relations with the Taliban could find themselves scrutinized for complicity with apartheid. Given the current dire situation, there is no other way to achieve progress on human rights than to concert the efforts of the international community, and to do so within the framework of global obligations to combat apartheid. As Horia Mossadegh, who I interviewed for the paper as well, told me, quote, "The Taliban are known for being a gender apartheid group, and there is no space in the 21st century for any form of gender apartheid, for any form of apartheid, including gender apartheid." Informed by her words and those of her fellow Afghan women's rights advocates, we need a renewed international effort to support Afghan women human rights defenders in realizing the end of Taliban apartheid. Thanks for listening, and I wish you the very best for a successful panel and conference.